Okay, so you guys really went all out this time, huh? You sent in a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's, I'll be honest, a little intimidating.
Right.
It's William Blum's Killing Hope, U.S. military and CIA interventions since World War II.
That's right. Yeah.
So this is going to be a deep dive.
It is. It is a deep
A
dive.
deep dive into, well, I guess U.S. interventionism.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at a whole lot of interventions.
Right, and it's not just going to be like, okay, and then this happened, and then this happened. We're going to try to see if we can, like, find the
Yeah,
patterns.
what are the motivations? What are the justifications that keep coming up again and again?
What are the recurring themes and ideas behind all of these different actions?
Exactly.
So, one of the things that jumped out at me right away, even in Blum's introduction, was this observation about how perceptions of the United States, I mean, globally, really shifted after World War II.
Yeah, how could they not? We're talking about a massive change in the global landscape.
Right. And Blum starts with this quote from a Vietcong officer
Oh, yeah?
to an American prisoner. And the quote is, "You were our heroes after the war. What happened?"
Wow.
And it's such a simple question, but it's so profound, you know?
It really is.
Because it seems like there was this like initial outpouring of goodwill towards America. We had just, helped defeat fascism.
We were seen as liberators, as a force for good in the world.
Right, exactly. But then something changed.
Well, as Blum argues, a lot of things changed.
Right.
But a major factor was this intense focus on anti-communism.
Yeah, and he quotes Michael Berenti,
Oh, right, yeah.
who says, and this is, I think, a really key quote, he says, "Our fear that communism might someday take over most of the world blinds us to the fact that anti-communism already has."
And that right there, that's the lens through which we need to look at all of this,
It's like, it's not even about communism itself anymore. It's about this almost like obsessive fear of it. This
Exactly.
anti-communist ideology that's driving so much of U.S. policy.
Right. It became the defining framework for understanding and responding to global events.
So, okay, let's, I guess, unpack this anti-communist sentiment a little bit.
Okay, sure.
Because Blum goes into some of the historical roots of it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of wild. Like, we're talking about early 20th century portrayals of Bolshevik Russia as like this bedlam
Right.
run by homicidal maniacs.
Yeah, the language was so over the top.
It's almost cartoonish.
It's like they were trying to paint this picture of pure chaos and evil.
Right. And it's not just like fringe publications doing this. Blum points out that even the New Republic, which was considered, a fairly mainstream publication at the time,
Yeah, definitely.
they were pointing out this really interesting thing. The New York Times, they kept prematurely declaring that the Soviets were about to collapse.
Like, how many times are they going to get that wrong?
I know. And Blum says they did it 91 times in just 2 years.
That's amazing.
So it's like, you have to wonder, was it just bad reporting?
Or was there something else going on?
Right. Was there this like almost a hopefulness? Like they wanted the Soviets to collapse so badly that they kept jumping the gun.
Yeah, like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have figures like John Foster Dulles.
Oh, yeah, he was a big player in shaping U.S. foreign policy after the war.
Right. He was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. And he had this like very black and white view of the world,
Yeah, totally. It was us versus them, good versus evil.
Yeah. He talks about Christians and free enterprise.
Versus the others.
Right. And he's not even like trying to be subtle about it. He just flat out says that there's no room for neutralism.
You were either with the U.S. or against them.
And if you were against them, well, you were probably a communist, in his view.
And that makes you a potential target.
Right. So this kind of sets the stage for how these interventions start to play out.
Definitely. And Blum points out that a common justification for these interventions was, well, the KGB did it first.
Ah, the classic blame game.
Right. But Blum actually quotes a former CIA officer, John Stockwell.
Okay.
And Stockwell talks about how there was actually sometimes fraternization and respect between the CIA and the KGB.
Wait, really? I thought they were supposed to be sworn enemies.
Well, it's more complicated than that, apparently.
Oh.
And Stockwell makes this really important point. Even if the KGB did do something first, it doesn't justify the CIA going around and, like, destabilizing democracies.
It's not like, oh, well, they cheated, so we can cheat too.
Exactly. Two wrongs don't make a right. And it's certainly not a valid excuse for undermining a country's right to choose its own path.
So if it wasn't just about, like, tit-for-tat retaliation against the KGB, then what was the real reason behind these interventions?
Well, Blum's argument is that it all boils down to this idea of self-determination.
Okay, what does that mean in this context?
It means that a lot of countries in the third world, they were trying to break free from colonial rule.
Right.
They wanted to chart their own course both economically and politically.
And that didn't sit well with the U.S.
Not always, no.
Why not?
Well, Blum identifies a few key things that seem to trigger a U.S. response. First, any desire to break free from existing U.S. economic or political control was seen as a threat.
So it's not like they were just opposed to, like, all colonialism. It was specifically when it challenged their own interests.
That's right.
Okay, what else?
Second, any refusal to cut off ties with the socialist bloc, or to suppress their own leftist political groups, or to host U.S. military bases.
So basically any sign that they weren't going to be completely aligned with the U.S.
Exactly. And third, any attempt to change a government that was favorable to U.S. interests.
Ah, so they didn't mind meddling in other countries' affairs as long as it was to their benefit.
It seems that way. Yeah.
And it's interesting because this idea of, like, internal movements being seen as some kind of foreign plot, it's not new, is it?
Not at all.
Blum draws some really interesting parallels to earlier historical periods,
Oh, yeah.
like King George blaming the French for the American Revolution,
Right.
or the accusations that the protesters in Shays' Rebellion were British agents.
And let's not forget the way labor movements were constantly being blamed on anarchists, foreigners, German agents, and of course, Bolsheviks.
It's almost like there's this ingrained tendency to dismiss any kind of internal dissent as being orchestrated by outside forces.
It's a way to delegitimize legitimate grievances and resistance.
And it's a tactic that was used very effectively during the Cold War.
Absolutely. And the scary part is it's still being used today.
Oh, for sure. So, okay, we've talked about the motivations behind these interventions, but did the American public even know about them at the time?
Well, that's another interesting point that Blum makes. He says that a lot of these early interventions, they weren't big news back in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah, like he gives some examples. CIA incursions into China in the early 1950s, the bombing of Guatemala in 1960, encouraging a revolt in Iraq in 1973.
And none of this was widely reported.
Not really, no. And Blum suggests that even when these events were mentioned, they were often framed in a way that made them seem less significant. Like it would just be presented as, oh, well, the communist governments are making these accusations, which, the American public was basically conditioned to dismiss as propaganda.
Right, so there's this whole side to the story that most people were just completely unaware of.
Exactly. And that raises some really important questions about how history gets written and remembered.
Because if the information isn't there in the first place, how could people even begin to form an accurate understanding of what happened?
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Right, and Blum actually mentions the Pentagon Papers criteria,
Oh, wow, yeah.
which, according to the New York Times summary, involved a non-recognition of American interventions in encyclopedias.
So it's like they were actively trying to erase these events from the historical record.
It's crazy, right?
It really makes you think about whose versional events becomes the accepted one.
And Blum uses this example with Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State under Kennedy and Johnson.
Okay.
So Rusk, he had this seemingly, like, broad-minded view of the Chinese Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He compared it to the American and French revolutions.
Interesting.
But at the same time, his own government was actively plotting against the Chinese communists.
Oh, wow. That's wild.
So it's like there's this huge disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality.
And that seems to be a recurring theme throughout all of this.
Yeah, and Blum's conclusion from all of this is very direct. He says, American foreign policy is what American foreign policy does.
He's not missing words, is he?
Nope. He's basically saying that it doesn't matter what the stated intentions are. The reality is that the U.S. has consistently intervened in other countries' affairs, often with disastrous consequences.
And he's not afraid to call out the human cost of these interventions either.
Right. In the 1995 introduction to the book, he draws a parallel between the denial of U.S. interventions and Holocaust denial.
That's a powerful statement.
Yeah, he's talking about millions of deaths and untold suffering as a result of these actions.
It's a sobering reminder that these aren't just abstract geopolitical maneuvers. They have real-world consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And, one of the narratives you often hear about the end of the Cold War is that it was solely due to American pressure.
Right, like we single-handedly brought down the Soviet Union.
But Blum actually quotes Gorbachev.
Oh, interesting.
And Gorbachev very clearly states that the shifts in Soviet policy, like the reduction in military spending, were driven by internal factors independently of U.S. actions.
So it wasn't just about Reagan's Star Wars program or anything like that.
Apparently not. It seems like the Soviet Union was already on a path towards reform, and the U.S. just kind of took credit for it.
That's a very different perspective than what we usually hear.
Right. And it speaks to this tendency to oversimplify history, to create these neat narratives that fit our existing worldview.
And to ignore the complexities and nuances that don't fit that narrative.
Exactly. So, okay, we've talked about the broader context of U.S. interventionism, but now let's dive into some specific examples from the early years of the Cold War.
Okay, sounds good.
And it's striking how quickly this anti-communist focus took hold after World War II.
Yeah, it's almost like the ink wasn't even dry on the peace treaties before they were already moving on to the next enemy.
Right. And Blum points out that even before the war officially ended in some regions, the U.S. was already using Japanese soldiers in China, alongside American troops, against the Chinese communists.
Wow, that's wild. So they were basically fighting alongside their former enemies.
It shows you how quickly the priorities shifted.
Yeah, from defeating fascism to containing communism.
And Blum goes into a lot of detail about China in these early chapters.
Okay.
He talks about how the U.S. was heavily supporting Chiang Kai-shek.
Right, the leader of the nationalist government.
Even though the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, they were acknowledging that Chiang's efforts were mainly directed at the communists, not the Japanese.
So they were more concerned with fighting their own internal rivals than with fighting the actual enemy in World War II.
Yeah, it wasn't like Chiang was some kind of benevolent leader either. His regime was notoriously corrupt, and he had a lot of collaborators working with him.
But he was staunchly anti-communist, and that's all that seemed to matter to the U.S.
It's like ideology trumped everything else.
And what happened when the communists eventually did take control in China?
Well, the U.S. wasn't exactly happy about it.
I can imagine.
They started initiating these military incursions into China from Burma using remnants of Chiang's forces.
Oh, wow, so they were actively trying to undermine the new government.
Yeah, and Blum says that the aim seems to have been to divert Chinese resources away from Korea and Vietnam.
So it was part of this broader strategy of containment.
Right, and he even suggests that they might have been trying to provoke China into attacking neutral Burma.
That's a pretty risky move.
It was a high-stakes game they were playing.
And then there's Korea, of course.
Right, another major flashpoint in the early Cold War.
And Blum challenges some of the conventional wisdom about the Korean War, particularly when it comes to American POWs.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, there's this long-held belief that the high death toll among American prisoners was solely due to communist cruelty.
Right, that they were tortured and brainwashed and all that.
But Blum cites a U.S. Army study that actually shows a more nuanced picture.
Okay.
He says that the actual death toll was lower than initial claims.
Huh, interesting.
And while the treatment of prisoners certainly wasn't in line with the Geneva Convention, it rarely involved outright cruelty with the intent of forcing collaboration.
So it's not as black and white as it's often portrayed.
Right, and Blum also mentions the allegations of U.S. germ warfare against North Korea and China.
Wow, I've never heard that before.
And there was apparently even a CIA plot to assassinate Kim Il-sung.
It's a very different picture than what we usually get in, like, history textbooks.
Yeah, it's more complicated and a lot darker.
So we've got China, Korea. What else is going on in these early years?
Well, Blum talks about Albania, for example. In the early 1950s, there was a joint U.S.-British attempt to overthrow the pro-Soviet regime there.
So another intervention?
Yeah, but this one actually failed.
Why did it fail?
Partly because of the infamous Soviet spy Kim Philby.
Oh, wow, like a real-life spy thriller.
Right, and there's this irony to the whole thing. Even though the U.S. and Britain tried so hard to get rid of the Albanian leader Enver Hoxha, it was actually Hoxha himself who later pulled Albania out of the Soviet sphere of influence.
So they basically achieved the opposite of what they intended.
It shows you how these interventions can often backfire.
And Blum also talks about Eastern Europe more broadly,
Okay.
including something called Operation Splinter Factor.
What was that?
It was basically a series of covert actions aimed at disrupting and destabilizing the communist governments in Eastern Europe.
So more meddling.
Yeah, and he tells this really interesting story about a Polish defector, Józef Swatlow.
Okay.
And Swatlow, he provided the U.S. with a lot of information about the inner workings of the Polish Communist Party.
So valuable intelligence, I guess.
Right. And Blum also mentions this really weird detail about Alan Dulles.
Oh, the head of the CIA?
Yeah. During the war, through the OSS, Dulles actually financed a left-wing anti-fascist newspaper in Germany.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah. And then, ironically, this newspaper became the official newspaper of East Germany's Communist Party.
That's amazing.
It's like this crazy, tangled web of shifting alliances and objectives.
It shows you how complicated things were during this period.
Yeah, and how the U.S. was willing to work with anyone, even people they considered ideological enemies, as long as it served their interests.
And speaking of shifting alliances, let's talk about Iran.
Okay, the overthrow of Mossadegh.
Right, a classic case of Cold War intervention.
And Blum really emphasizes the role of the U.S., particularly the CIA, in this operation.
Yeah, they were the driving force behind it.
And their main concern was oil.
Of course.
And also the potential for Soviet influence in the region.
Which, to be fair, was a legitimate concern at the time.
Right, but the way they went about it was very problematic.
Yeah, they basically overthrew a democratically elected leader.
and installed a Shah who was, let's just say, not exactly a champion of human rights.
It had devastating consequences for Iran, both in the short term and the long term.
And then we have Guatemala in 1954.
Another U.S.-backed coup.
Yeah. And Blum goes into a lot of detail about how the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz.
And Arbenz, he was also democratically elected, right?
He was, and his main crime seems to have been his land reform program.
Oh, right. He wanted to redistribute land from large estates to landless peasants.
Yeah, which really upset the United Fruit Company, which was an American company that owned a lot of land in Guatemala.
So economic interests at play again.
Definitely. And of course, there were the usual accusations of communist sympathies.
Even though Arbenz himself wasn't a communist, right?
Right. And Blum talks about the propaganda campaign, the arming of rebels, the economic pressure.
It's like they had a playbook for these interventions.
And they just kept using it over and over again.
And Guatemala, like Iran, suffered the consequences for decades.
Absolutely. And Blum also mentions the CIA's attempts to undermine Jose Figueres in Costa Rica.
Who was he?
He was a moderate socialist who had won a fair election.
Okay.
And his crime seemed to have been that he recognized the right of asylum for both communists and non-communists.
So he was basically being punished for being too tolerant.
Yeah, and he also supported groups that were trying to overthrow U.S.-backed right-wing dictatorships in the region.
It's almost like he was doing the opposite of what the U.S. was doing.
And that made him a target.
It's really strange when you think about it. Like, the U.S. was supposed to be promoting democracy, but they were actively undermining a democratically elected leader.
It shows you how warped their priorities were.
And we're not even done yet.
Nope. Blum also talks about Syria and Lebanon in the late 1950s.
Okay.
In Syria, there are these plots to cultivate disruptive elements within the military.
So trying to foment a coup, basically.
Yeah. And it seems like they were almost trying to provoke Syria into attacking a neighboring Arab country.
Why would they do that?
To create a justification for American intervention.
It's like they were looking for any excuse to get involved.
And in Lebanon, they actually did send in troops.
Wow, a full-blown military intervention.
Thousands of troops, based on the Eisenhower Doctrine.
And what was the Eisenhower Doctrine again?
It basically said that the U.S. would intervene in any Middle Eastern country that was threatened by communism.
So it gave them a pretty broad mandate.
Yeah, and it set a precedent for future interventions in the region.
And then there's Indonesia in the mid-1960s.
Oh man, that's a dark chapter.
What happened there?
Well, there was a coup attempt and then these mass killings of communists.
Oh, wow.
Hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people were killed.
That's horrific.
Yeah, and Blum suggests that the CIA might have played a role in creating the conditions for this violence.
Like how?
Well, they were providing support to the Indonesian military, which was carrying out the killings.
Oh, man, that's really messed up.
Yeah, and there's this chilling quote from the U.S. ambassador at the time.
What did he say?
He said that what the U.S. had to do was done, and that Asia was better off for it.
It's like he's completely glossing over the massive loss of life.
It's a very cold-blooded statement.
And it's not like these interventions were always just about brute force either.
Right.
Blum talks about the CIA's involvement in media and propaganda.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
They were funding news agencies, writers' organizations, even creating fake news stories.
So they were trying to control the narrative.
Absolutely. They wanted to shape public opinion both domestically and internationally.
And they were very successful at it.
It's scary to think about how much influence they had.
And then there were the Gladio operations in Europe.
What were those?
They were these supposedly stay-behind forces that were intended to resist a Soviet invasion.
Okay.
But there's evidence suggesting that they were also used to attack domestic leftist movements.
So they were basically a secret army that could be used to undermine democracy.
Yeah, it's pretty disturbing.
And Blum also talks about British Guiana.
Right, where the U.S. and Britain worked together to undermine the democratically elected Chetty Jagan.
And why did they want to get rid of him?
Because he was a socialist.
Ah, of course.
And they were terrified of having a socialist government in the Western Hemisphere.
It's like they were willing to do anything to prevent that, even if it meant subverting democracy.
Yeah, it's a very dark period in U.S. history.
Well, we've only just scratched the surface here.
Right, Blum goes on to cover so much more. The U-2 incident, the CIA's influence on books, flawed intelligence gathering on the Soviet Union, the early stages of interventions in Italy and Vietnam.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But it's important to understand this history because it's still shaping our world today.
And it makes you wonder, have we really learned anything from these past mistakes?
It's a good question. So as you process all of this, think about this. Given the patterns the intervention we've discussed, driven by anti-communism and, as Blum argues, often triggered by nations seeking self-determination, what are the implications for understanding current global conflicts? Has the motivations for intervention really changed? Or have they just adapted to a new geopolitical landscape? It's something to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.